Sophie Cunningham just pulled off something very few WNBA players managed to do. Without forcing it, she created one of the most talked about viral moments of the week. While fans celebrated Sophie, the conversation around Angel Reese went in a completely different direction. Suddenly, people weren't just comparing their games, they were comparing their brands. And that's where this story becomes much bigger than basketball, because in today's WNBA, attention alone isn't enough. The real question is this: who do fans actually trust enough to support? If you want to understand why Sophie Cunningham's brand feels like it is rising while Angel Reese's feels much more uncertain, it starts with one simple idea. People respond differently to something that feels organic than they do to something that feels forced. That is where Sophie's UFC moment comes in. She was not there trying to launch a campaign. She was not walking into a carefully scripted brand activation. She was not standing in front of a sponsor backdrop delivering polished lines. She was just there in the moment, and it felt natural. That is why it spread. The clip worked because it did not look manufactured. It looked fun, it looked spontaneous, it looked like the kind of thing people send to friends because it feels real, not because a marketing team told them it mattered. Those are the moments brands love, not just because they go viral, but because they reveal something more valuable: how people feel about the person at the center of the clip. And in Sophie Cunningham's case, the reaction said a lot. People did not just notice her, they liked her. That distinction is huge. Because brands today are not only chasing reach, they are chasing trust. They want someone whose image feels consistent, someone whose personality makes sense across interviews, games, social clips, and sponsor campaigns. That is a big part of why Sophie works. She does not come across like she is trying to perform a version of herself for the internet. Fans feel like what they see is what they get. And once that feeling exists, merchandise and brand opportunities become easier to imagine. Not guaranteed, but easier. Now compare that to Angel Reese. Reese has something very few athletes ever get: immediate attention at scale. She draws reactions, she gets people talking, she has a built-in audience, she creates headlines almost automatically. That is real value. But there is a major difference between being watched and being embraced. That is where things get more complicated. A big social following does not automatically mean people will buy the product. A loud online presence does not automatically mean fans feel connected enough to spend. And that may be the core tension in Reese's brand right now. She is visible, no question. But visibility becomes much more fragile when the public conversation around you is split between admiration, backlash, controversy, and skepticism. That is when brands start paying closer attention, not just to raw attention numbers, to sentiment. How do people talk about you? Do they trust you? Do they like you? Do they see your public image as authentic or strategic? Do they feel like they are buying into a person or into a performance? Those questions matter more than people think, because in modern sports marketing, authenticity often outperforms scale. Not always, but often. That is why Sophie Cunningham's rise feels meaningful. It is not just about one appearance. It is not just about one shoe announcement. It is about the kind of reaction she consistently gets from people who feel like they know exactly who she is. That is hard to fake. And it is especially valuable in a league where fan loyalty is increasingly tied to personality, chemistry, and trust. The teammate angle matters too. Sophie has built a lot of goodwill by the way fans perceive her role around Caitlin Clark and the Fever. She comes across as loyal, protective, direct, comfortable being herself. That kind of identity becomes part of the brand, whether a company plans it or not. Fans start telling the story for you. That is when a player's image gets stronger. Not when the athlete declares who they are, when the audience starts doing it for them. That is one area where the contrast with Reese becomes sharper. When a player publicly claims a certain label too early, fans sometimes push back, not necessarily because they dislike the player, but because audiences usually want to decide for themselves who feels iconic, trustworthy, or culturally important. That cannot be forced, and when the market does not fully validate the self-image being projected, the gap becomes visible fast. That is the risk. Because once people sense a gap between the brand claim and the actual buying behavior, the conversation changes. It stops being, "Look how popular this player is," and becomes, "Why is the popularity not converting?" That is a much tougher conversation. And that is why the Sophie versus Reese contrast is so interesting. It is not really about who is more famous. Reese may still be more famous in raw attention terms. It is about whose fame feels more stable, whose image feels more trusted, whose audience looks more likely to show up not just with likes but with actual support. That is the difference between attention and brand strength. The biggest stars usually have both. But when those two things split apart, it becomes obvious quickly. One player can trend constantly and still struggle to turn that into durable consumer confidence. Another player can have less overall fame but a much stronger connection with the people who actually buy in. That is what this moment seems to be exposing. And zoom out even further, this is not just about Sophie Cunningham or Angel Reese. It is about where the WNBA is heading as a business. As the league grows, more players will get big opportunities, shoe deals, endorsements, crossover campaigns, lifestyle branding. But the players who win biggest may not always be the loudest. They may be the ones who feel most believable. That is what brands are really buying now. Not just stats, not just followers, not just controversy, believability. And right now, Sophie Cunningham's brand feels like it is benefiting from that in a very real way. While Angel Reese's brand still has enormous visibility, it also feels like it is being tested by a much harder question: can attention turn into trust? Because once brands and fans start separating those two things, the answer matters a lot.